In this video, we're going to be looking at using bar charts in technical writing. Bar charts are a very commonly and very widely used type of chart. You see them everywhere. So it's important to know how to use them and, of course, how to write about them. So that's what we're going to be looking at here. So the outcomes for this video are first to define what we mean when we talk about bar charts, and then to be able to explain what type of data bar charts are used for. Next, we want to be able to recognize the different kinds of charts and their different functions and to produce bar charts effectively. And most importantly, of course, what we want to do is we want to be able to analyze and describe the contents of a bar chart. So let's just first remind ourselves why we use graphs and charts in the first place. As we said in a previous video, graphs and charts are used to display data using shapes, colors, and patterns. And the reason that we do that is because it's very easy for our readers to identify trends in data when we use charts and graphs. They don't need to read anything, they can just look at the shapes and immediately they can identify the trends that we want them to see. So that's why we use charts and graphs, and that's why they're effective in technical writing. Now, specifically, we want to talk here about bar charts and the kind of data that they're used for. Here we have an example of a simple bar chart. And bar charts are used to display what we call discrete categories of data. It's very important to understand this from the beginning. Bar charts are used to display discrete categories of data. Now, what does that mean? Well, here we have another example of a bar chart. This chart shows us fitness center membership in 2016 for men and women in 6 different countries. And this is an example of what we call discrete data. So if we look at Canada, for example, we can see that 31% of men in Canada were members of fitness centers and 46% of women. Now, if one of those numbers were to change, let's say the number of men increased to 40%, that doesn't affect the number of women. The number of women could still stay the same. Similarly, if the number of men in Canada increased, it wouldn't affect the number of men in any of the other countries. That's because these categories of data are discrete. They're related, but they're not connected in the sense that one number changing doesn't affect any other number. On the other hand, when you look at a pie chart, here the different sections of the pie chart must always add up to 100%. So if the 24% here, which is dedicated to research, increased to, let's say, 26%, we would have to lose 2% from one of the other sections, or maybe 2 of the other sections. So this data is not discrete. So we use bar charts to display discrete data where each bar represents a specific discrete quantity. So now we know basically what a bar chart does. Let's look at the different types of charts and their functions. First, we have the basic bar chart. Here we use a basic bar chart when we have just one trend or theme that we want to display. And we can see here that we only have one set of bars because we're only looking at one piece of data. Next, we have a horizontal chart. This is essentially the same as the basic chart, except here the bars run horizontally rather than vertically. Now, some people use horizontal charts just because they think they look nicer, but there are a couple of really valid reasons why we might want to use them. First, they're very handy to use when you have a lot of categories to display. Because generally speaking, if you're working on a page that's in portrait mode, a horizontal chart would allow you to fit a lot more bars on the page comfortably without having to squeeze things together. The other reason you might use a horizontal chart is when the names of your categories are quite long. If you have long category names, it could be very difficult to fit them all together on the page without turning them on their side or diagonally. If you use a horizontal chart, you can make more space for the category names just by making the bars shorter. Another very commonly used type of chart, and this is the one that we're going to be looking at mostly, is what we call the grouped chart. So here in a group chart, we have separate bars to represent subgroups. So if we look at the example in front of us, we can see here that we have 6 different types of vehicle. And then those different types of vehicles have again been divided up into 3 what we call subgroups. Cars from Asia, cars from Europe, and those from the USA. So a chart like this allows us not only to compare the main groups, but also to compare the subgroups with each other and within the different main groups as well. We also have what we call a stacked chart. Now this is obviously quite similar to the group chart, but is also different in one very important way. And that is because by stacking the subgroups on top of each other, it makes it much easier for us to compare the overall totals of the major groups or the main groups. And here we have an example of that. So if we look at this chart here, while it's very clear for us to see that Samsung is the highest selling and Apple was the second highest, it's much more difficult to compare the total sales for January and February of HTC and LG, because the blue bar is higher for HTC and the red bar is higher for LG. So it's a little bit more complicated here to see in an instant which one had the higher sales over the 2 months. But if we use a stack chart, we can see instantly that HTC had higher sales over the 2 months. So those are the different kinds of bar chart you might want to use. Now let's look at the key parts that you must make sure you include anytime you create a bar chart. So here we have the example that we looked at already of the different kinds of vehicles. And this chart contains all of the key things that we must have when we are designing and making a bar chart. You must make sure that your measurements are clearly stated and that your your axes are labeled. You must, of course, have a title so people know what the chart is about. And you must have your category names. If you don't have the category names, people don't know what the bars represent. And if you are making a group chart or a stack chart, you must have what we call a key, so people know what the different colors within each group represent. So those are the things you need to have when you are designing or making a bar chart. There are also some important things you need to remember when you're using them. First thing, you should only really use a bar chart when you have values that are noticeably different. It's not a good idea to use a bar chart when the difference between the two numbers is very small, because the whole point of a bar chart is to make things clear for our reader. If the difference between two bars is very small, it doesn't make things very clear to the reader. You're better off just using words and explaining the difference in the numbers. If you are going to use a bar chart, then you need to make sure that it's simple and easy to read. We talked about this before. The purpose of charts and graphs is to present the data in a clear and easily understandable way. So you defeat the purpose of that if you make the chart crowded and confusing. So make sure you don't include too much information. Keep it clear for your readers. Similarly, you need to make sure that your chart is properly labeled so that people know what they're looking at, and that you number your scales and units in units that are familiar to your audience. Fives, tens, hundreds, and so on. And lastly, make sure you use colors and patterns effectively to make your graph easy to read. If you're making a grouped chart, make sure that the different colors for the different subgroups are very easily distinguishable. Don't use two colors that are very, very close together, because people are not going to be able to tell the difference. Now, of course, the thing we're most interested in is analyzing and describing bar charts. writing about them. So now we're going to look at a few things you need to do to make sure that you effectively describe a bar chart. Now, the first thing you need to remember is that we don't need to discuss the information that the chart represents. Rather, we just need to write a report about the information. What does that mean? Well, if we look at this same chart again, we can see here, for example, that sedans are by far and away the most popular kind of car. Then you have SUV and sports cars are also quite popular. So that's what we want to say when we are writing about this chart. What we don't want to do is discuss why we think sedans are the most popular, or why SUVs from Asia are more popular than SUVs from Europe. We don't want to talk about that because we don't know. We can make guesses, but they would only be guesses. The information is not in the chart. The chart doesn't tell us why sedans are more popular than other kinds of cars. So we shouldn't talk about that. We should just talk about what the chart explicitly tells us, which is that sedans are more popular and that Asian sedans are more popular than American sedans, and which are more popular than European sedans. We stick to what the chart shows us. We don't make guesses or assumptions about anything else. So when we're writing about it, we start with an introductory sentence where we clearly state what the chart is about. And here we have an example. So here we have a bar chart that shows us the percentage of students who are proficient in a foreign language in 6 different countries. And it compares males and females. And that's all we need to say in our introductory sentence. Figure 1 is a bar chart that shows the percentage of students who are proficient in a foreign language in 6 different countries. That's all we need to say. That's more than enough for our introductory sentence. If you remember, we said that one of the ways to differentiate between an introductory sentence and a topic sentence is that to write the introductory sentence, you don't need to see the bars. You can use just the title and maybe the labels. That's enough there's enough information for you to write an effective introductory sentence. But once you've introduced the chart, now you need a topic sentence. Now you need to state the trend. So you need to explain the main idea shown in the data. So if we look at this same chart again, we can see quite clearly that in 5 of the 6 countries, more females are proficient in a foreign language than males. And that's what we've said here in our topic sentence. As shown, overall, a far higher percentage of female students are proficient in a foreign language than males. There is an exception to that, but it's not a problem because we didn't say in every country. We said overall. So once we have our clearly stated trend in our topic sentence, now we need to give detailed examples that prove that trend. We need to give specific examples using the data. We need to give numbers that prove the trend we identified. And you can see we've done that here by talking about the percentage of proficient female students in India and comparing that with the males. Similarly, we've compared the proficient females in Romania with the percentage of proficient males. So here, by comparing the males with the females in those 2 countries, we've given very specific examples, detailed numbers that prove the trend we identified, that female students tend to be more proficient than males. Now, we did say that this is only true in 5 of the 6 countries. In Thailand, we can see that there are more male students who are proficient than females, and that's okay. You can mention exceptions to the trend. If you have a trend but there is an exception to it, it's fine. You can talk about that in your paragraph. But importantly, you must make it clear that it is an exception to the trend. So here we said Thailand is the only country in the chart where more male students are proficient than females. So we stated our main idea, our trend, and now we followed that up with specific examples, and we've mentioned that there was an exception to it. We want to finish our sentence, or sorry, our paragraph, excuse me, with a concluding sentence where we simply restate the main idea. We want to remind our audience of the trend that we identified, but we want to make sure we don't just write the same sentence. We want the same meaning, but we need to use different words when we're doing that. So here we've said fluency in a foreign language is far more prominent amongst women than it is amongst men. So a reminder that the topic and concluding sentences in a paragraph are like the buns or the two halves of the bun in a burger, in that the substance is the same, but the form is different. So let's just quickly look at a couple of things that we shouldn't do when we are describing a bar chart. The first one, which we have talked about before, don't mention everything. The reason we use a bar chart in the first place is so that we can present all of the data quickly and easily. So when we describe it, we only want to talk about the important things. And we can see here in the example we looked at, when we talk about Vietnam, Russia, and China, we don't really give any detailed information. We just said they also followed the trend. If the reader wants that detailed information, they can get it by looking at the chart. Next thing you shouldn't do is describe the bars. You have to remember that the bars represent something. So talk about what the bars represent. You can see here we said 68% of female students, 55% of males. This is what the bars represent. So try not to use the word bar when you're describing a bar chart. Talk about what the bar represents. And the last thing, which is a general English language point, don't start a sentence with a number. Okay, we're using a lot of numbers here, and we want to use a lot of numbers, but make sure you don't use them at the start of a sentence. Always try to put a word before the number that you use, and you can use words like similarly or around, and that will allow you to then use the number that you want to use. So one last thing we want to look at before we finish is explicit comparison. We use bar charts because we want to compare different sets of data. So when we are writing about the chart, we need to make sure that those comparisons are very clear and very obvious for our readers. So here we have an example of what we call an implicit comparison. We've said here in two sentences, approximately 65% of women speak a foreign language, around 45% of men speak a foreign language. Now, anybody who reads these two sentences can see that the percentage of women who speak a foreign language is higher than the percentage of men. But here, we don't specifically say or explicitly say that the percentage is higher. So while a reader can see that for themselves, they don't necessarily know that that is the point we are trying to make. So we need to make our comparisons explicit by joining those two pieces of information together using a phrase or a word that makes it very clear the point we're trying to make. So here we've said approximately 65% of women speak a foreign language, but only 45% of men speak one. So here it becomes very clear that we are saying the percentage of women is higher than the percentage of men, or the percentage of men is lower than the percentage of women. So we should always try to use appropriate language to make sure that our comparisons are explicit. Make it as explicit as you can to the reader that this is what you are trying to say. Don't just give them two numbers and let them try to work out for themselves that one number is higher than the other. Tell them this number is higher than that number. So quickly to review, we looked at what we use graphs and charts for, and we said that is to make a lot of information much easier for our readers to understand. We looked at the different kinds, or we looked at what bar charts are used for, and then we looked at the different types of charts. And we also looked at the key parts that you must include whenever you are using a bar chart, and things to think about in terms of using the colors and making sure that everything is clear and easy to read. We then look more closely at analyzing how to structure your paragraph by stating a clear trend and then giving examples of that trend. And we've just looked at making sure that your comparisons are explicit. I hope this video has been helpful, and I will see you next time.